Good, how are you?
Today?
Yes, I'm very confident.
The Federal Liberal Party has spent the last 5 years of its 50-year history wrestling with its beliefs and its leadership.
I'm the most conservative leader the Liberal Party's ever had.
I'm not looking, in a sense, for popularity. I'd rather have a reputation for being able to address the problem and address realistic solutions to those problems.
The Liberal Party has always been a common-sense, practical political party.
Mr Keating is very much a street-fighting politician.
Yet over the years, politics has also changed at the grassroots.
What does the parliamentary party...
Political party membership is in decline throughout Australia.
...match that?
At the end of the day, a majority of Australians voted for that, didn't they?
Liberals have half the members they had when Menzies took them to power in 1949.
I suspect the Liberal Party's membership has become more conservative as things have contracted.
Despite a changing world, the Federal Party's response to electoral loss has remained constant. The theatre and intrigue of the leadership challenge. The search for someone to guide them from the wilderness.
Institutionally, it has to be said the Liberal Party is a party that is built around leadership. It expects to have a strong leader. It looks to support a strong leader, and it works best when it doesn't have leadership problems.
In its 45th year, the Federal Liberal Party had entered new territory, its longest ever period of opposition. No Liberal leader since Menzies had survived an election loss and kept his job. Yet John Howard fancied his chances for a second general election. Interest rates were climbing towards 18%, and national debt for the year was over $17 billion.
The first half of 1988 was terrific for the Liberal Party. We won the Adelaide by-election with a 9% swing. We got a 13% swing in Port Adelaide. We won the Groom by-election from the National Party. And Nick Greiner won in New South Wales. I mean, it was a vintage 6 months.
My car is behind there, I'll bet.
Yet Howard seemed unable to build a united team, which worried strong supporters like Senator Michael Boehm.
Now, you really aren't going to...
I thought some of his judgments relating to people should have been a lot better. Someone who had an important matter that they went to see him about, and John would obviously be preoccupied with something else. And it would be seen in the sort of glazed look in his eye where he would be obviously trying to resolve another problem while purporting to talk to the person.
It's very much a coalition house. I mean, it's not so small as to be seen as totally suburban, but it's not so big as to be seen as rural. Matt, I'm not off...
In all, Howard presided over a party that was divided by his feud with Andrew Peacock and by deep ideological differences.
I was asked actually about...
Well, Howard, I think, is a poor leader. He is a very myopic individual, a very narrow view of the world, and he certainly embraced the Treasury doctrine and was committed to some economic reforms, but then again most of us were. And I said from the day he became leader that the real challenge was in the area of non-economic policy.
My difficulty, for example, with John Howard in terms of leadership was that while I was very flattered to be invited to be his environment spokesman, I never actually managed to win any of the major environmental debates because I didn't have sufficient support from John Howard as leader, having given me the job, to actually get on and make those difficult decisions.
Howard's opponents began to organise. A core of Peacock supporters, calling themselves the Cardinals, drew up secret plans in the Canberra apartment of one of their members, John Moore.
It started by a group of us being somewhat concerned as to where we were. Elliot out of the race. We're looking extraordinarily ordinary, about a year out from election. what on earth were we going to do?
Well, obviously Andrew was a participant in all of our discussions with, I think, one or two exceptions.
Public was one of the ones who said to me, even on the January, I think it was, of that year, you have got to tell us whether you want to do this. And he was demanding it. He said, you just equivocate all the time. You keep saying, oh, you don't know. So I would sit and talk with them, and they'd have meetings, etc. But I hadn't indicated to them firmly I wanted to do this sort of thing.
Your Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, Your Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales.
High-profile Liberal President John Elliott had toyed with the top job himself. Unable to secure a safe seat in Parliament, he now wanted to see Howard replaced by Andrew Peacock.
I'd made a judgment that he was the only alternative candidate, and I think to his surprise, when we met, I suggested he ought to be the leader.
Apart from it being a surprise, it came after some of my colleagues getting quite aggressive in their demands that I be prepared to stand against John Howard. And I'd been reluctant to do this. So this decision of Elliott's put to me had quite a profound effect.
Well, a lot of the people that were very close to me, I did convince them that they ought to change from Howard to Peacock. There were meetings on policy and particularly economic policy and different things, and there were people that we felt ought to go into the shadow cabinet when he became leader.
One of the techniques that was used to keep it as quiet as possible was that no person outside the inside group of about half a dozen people knew the totality of the work that was being done. It's an old technique. I mean, it's a communist insurgent technique, really. It's a need-to-know basis. You tell the cells what they need to know. You don't tell them the totality because they love to talk.
In 1989, most Liberals wanted a new winning formula. But some felt their revolutionary energy should be public and focus not on leadership, but on the whole party's performance. 30-year-old Michael Kroger had just become president of the Victorian division.
People had to recognise that we were losing and couldn't go on the way we were, and people had to have a far more aggressive attitude to politics and to the Liberal Party. We needed to change the pre-selection system, which we did, to ensure that no member of Parliament, state or federal, took their seat for granted, and a number have found out that the party was serious about that.
Melbourne and its blue ribbon electorates had provided 3 Liberal Prime Ministers. Kroger wanted to reinvigorate that Victorian tradition with new blood. He had not specifically targeted Ian McPhee, unofficial leader of the left, but the effect of his campaign was to shift Victorian representation to the right. Conservative branch members within McPhee's Melbourne electorate came to Kroger saying they wanted a change.
A clearer indication of the Liberals' divisive ideological war is today's pre-selection contest for Goldstein.
Despite concerns in the federal organisation that this would narrow the party.
And the desert dry academic, Dr. David Kemp.
I still believe that the best Liberal Party is a party which spans a very wide spectrum of opinion. I was disappointed at the thought that there wasn't room for someone like Ian still in our party.
Well, my view is that that purge was absolutely necessary, an essential precondition for a reformist Conservative government. My role was not dissimilar to the role of others of promoting within the branch network Conservative candidates and seeking to mobilise numbers to defeat existing wet incumbents.
In a sense, I believe I had decided, at least subconsciously, that I didn't want to stay there if they weren't going to really want to embrace more liberal values.
Ian McPhee lost his pre-selection battle.
I congratulate Mr Costello on his win, and I'm...
On the same weekend, Roger Shipton, the man who had held out John Elliott, lost his pre-selection to a long-time ally of Michael Kroger.
That the candidate for pre-selection for Higgins will be Mr Peter Costello.
I am and always have been very much part of the mainstream of the Liberal Party, and I believe the mainstream of Australian values generally.
But the most dramatic events of a dramatic weekend were happening elsewhere, in secret. In Canberra, the Cardinals had the numbers to sack John Howard. But Peacock wanted John Howard's old friend and Senate leader Fred Chaney as his deputy. In Perth that weekend, it was arranged for fellow West Australian Peter Shack to visit Chaney's home.
I told him what was going to happen, that there was going to be a leadership challenge the next week, that we'd had the numbers for it to be successful, and that he could either be a part of it or be left out. And he was shocked.
I must say, I guess that indicates my state of mind as to where we're at. I had no trouble in believing that was quite possible, likely, true.
He had no idea as to the state of play, as to how far it had gone. Obviously, he would have been aware of the disquiet about John Howard's leadership. And he and Angela then absented themselves from the room and spoke about it for several minutes.
Well, I suppose on that weekend I had a choice. I mean, if I accepted, as I did, that there was going to be a successful challenge on the Tuesday, I could precipitate a 2 or 3 day violent row, which would be very bloody and very public, or I could remain silent and see it all happen as quietly and bloodlessly as possible. And I chose the latter. Whether that was the right thing to do or not is a matter that I suppose puzzled me at the time and will puzzle me forever.
Given the nature of our friendship over a long period of time, given that he occupied a senior position and that he had claimed the privilege of friendship over the years, what he should have done was simply have rung me and said, "Mate, they're after you and I can't help you." It would have given me a fighting chance. I think the reason he didn't do it was he was frightened I might survive.
On the same morning that Shack was meeting Chaney, John Elliott's man Ian Courtlang visited Andrew Peacock in his Melbourne terrace.
The whole point was to calm him down. But the thing that calmed him down most, of course, was a phone call from Shack about Chaney. It was clear from that phone call that Chaney, albeit reluctantly, was going to come over to our camp. That would deliver us not only his number, but also the symbolism of having Chaney as the deputy leader. And when we left that day, for Andrew was going off to the football and I was going back to Sydney, we went off to have a bowl of pasta together, and walking across that park, he floated like an emperor.
On the following Monday, Andrew Peacock and Fred Chaney cancelled a dinner engagement with John Howard. After dinner, a delegation arrived at John Howard's office in Parliament House.
Well, a couple of minutes before 8:30, my secretary said that Mr Peacock, Senator Chaney and Senator Lewis were outside and they wanted to see me, and I then started to feel quite uneasy. They came in and I offered them a drink and they said no thanks, and they sat down and Andrew said, "This is difficult, but a lot of people, 40 in number, want the leadership raised tomorrow." And I said, who are some of them? He said, "I can't tell you that." And I said to Fred and Austin, I said, "Are you supporting this?" And they said yes. And I said, "Well, there's really nothing more to say, is there?"
It was exactly the same feeling as you have when you say to an employee, your job has ended. I've had that unhappy task, both in government and in private enterprise. It's one of the least pleasant things that you ever have to do, and this meeting was no different. It was a very unpleasant thing to have to do.
It became obvious to me, because people wouldn't return my phone calls, that I was for the high jump. And I rang my wife and told her what was happening, and she woke up our kids, and a couple of them were asleep, and told them, and it was all a bit difficult.
Well, let them through. Ladies and gentlemen, the result of the ballots just held in the Liberal Party room are as follows. John Howard, 27. Andrew Peacock, 44.
Ladies and gentlemen, obviously by your attendance here, you're aware that there have been some changes in the upper echelons of the parties on our side of politics. You are quite free to ask any questions you like.
You a recycled failed leader?
Ah, that's what a nice remark. It casts my mind back to the predecessor in Kooyong, who himself resigned the leadership and, of course, became the most resilient and longest-serving Prime Minister in the history of this country. I look forward to repeating that.
But within days, the coup began to unravel. Some of the cardinals appeared on four corners to reveal how they'd done it.
At times, I guess, by downright lying.
Well, whoever used that expression, whether it was in any form of mea culpa or another way, I haven't seen the program, you'd have to ask them. But in fact, I find that sort of discussion quite tasteless, as I've indicated to you.
said he lied in order to...
I was stunned at that. I didn't know it had occurred. I was out doing a meeting for one of our members, and then I saw it, and I was just stunned.
Well, you do the party an enormous amount of harm if these operations don't succeed. You do it an equal amount of harm if it's carried out in a dragged-out manner.
Some people can't handle defeat, and some people can't handle victory. They had really sought to bring off a big victory, and they had difficulty coming to terms with that victory, you know.
Unfortunately, like many successful capturing objectives, we didn't dig in, and the Visigoths came and they overran us, and by the following Tuesday, basically it was all over.
You can't sweep under the carpet the fact that a couple of senior members of the Shadow Cabinet have gloated about the fact that they deceived people, and one of them said he had to tell downright lies. You can't sweep that
I
under
think
the
he
carpet.
used it mercilessly. John Howard basically hit the airwaves of Australia, basically television and radio, putting forward the view that he, Honest John, had been robbed of his rightful leadership of the Liberal Party by a gang of thugs.
Andrew Peacock's victory was soured.
He told the rest of Australians, is that the kind of minister you want in a Peacock?
I've indicated to you already my view on this matter. I don't think it helps the nation. I don't think it helps the party for this sort of thing to be paraded out.
In a Peacock-led government?
I would, of course, wish that everyone went through life without lying.
But how are you going to be able to work in future in Parliament with colleagues who, you know, plotted behind your back, got into corners and behind doors and said to people, look, we're going to get rid of Howard?
Well,
were they under pressure?
Well, there are...
John Howard was left to contemplate his 4 years as leader of the opposition.
I don't think anybody should ever become a leader or cease to be a leader in the circumstances I did. I became it by accident and I lost it by ambush. Neither was satisfactory, and therein lay the seeds of further difficulty.
As Andrew Peacock geared up for another campaign, there was another stumble.
Do you want to vote Liberal?
We have laboured under a misapprehension that there was $1 billion to be got out of Medicare. There's not.
Peter Shack's health policy, aimed at shifting people into private insurance, was dumped just before the election as too expensive.
We claimed it would be revenue neutral, and also at the same time we claimed that no one would be worse off. And I've got to say to you that we are now of the view that that's not possible.
Tony Eagleton's view was that we would suffer some damage, but that it would only last for a couple of days and we'd get away with it. Well, the fact is we didn't get away with it. The health policy had been expected for some time, and we were crucified for dumping it and coming out with a bland document just stating some principles.
Who is the man who's going to lead us out of Labor's blind alley? Ladies and gentlemen, the answer to that is Andrew Peacock, and let's welcome him here this afternoon.
As the campaign in 1990 got underway, the party was fighting the Four Corners revelations, the health policy fiasco, and an awkward advertising campaign.
The reality is, do you really care for your family? And the answer is Liberal.
The answer is Liberal.
I did not run the sort of campaign that I normally ran.
Child tax rebate of up to $350.
It was only in the last week where I told them, you can go to hell, we're changing this. And I went out and campaigned in my own way, and we came back very strongly in that last week. But it was turgid prior to that.
Well, if Bob Hawke is potentially the leader of the fourth term, of a record fourth term in government, then I suppose Andrew Peacock is potentially the only two-time loser amongst Conservative leaders. Can he possibly survive that, John Howard, if it happens?
We haven't lost this election.
No, I know you haven't. I know you haven't. I'm asking you a hypothetical question.
No, I'm not going to hypothesise.
All right.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, this election, regrettably, for the nation will not be known for quite some days.
The Liberals picked up seats, but it wasn't enough.
It is clear to us now that Labor has won the election, and I congratulate Mr Hawke.
The 7 years of Howard-Peacock rivalry and internal disagreements had taken their toll.
I do think the divisions between us and amongst our followers and amongst those who had different views were major contributing factors to keeping us out of office. But I think the Howard-Peacock element, whilst very important, the divisions that were there, very important, perhaps been exaggerated somewhat.
The claim that Peacock and I are to blame for all these defeats is absurd, and it represents an alibi for many people. I mean, it's become the sort of convenient thing you blame.
I think either man could have been a good Prime Minister of Australia if the other hadn't been there. It was a tragedy, and it was politically very expensive. In terms of my working life, it made my 40s, which should have been my most productive years, very wasteful. I think most of us can say the same thing.
The party's elite were battle-scarred.
Pressure's still mounting about a change of leadership. Are you feeling any of that sort of pressure?
Oh, no, not at all.
Andrew Peacock stood down as leader.
It's been a very strong result. Labor Party has suffered a disastrous result in Victoria.
Long-time federal director Tony Eggleton quit. Fred Chaney decided this would be his last parliament.
I haven't seen what the government has delivered to Mr Peacock's office.
Peacock supporter Peter Shack would also quit in 3 years.
Dr. Hewson, now's the time to make the announcement.
One of the few cleanskins was newcomer and shadow treasurer Dr John Hewson.
I just wanted to announce formally that I will be standing for the leadership of the Liberal Party.
I thought he was by far the best man for the job. I'd become close to him in the sense that he'd been a very hard-working shadow treasurer, and I thought he'd do a very good job as leader. And so I supported him.
There is no doubt that John was not ready in early 1990. It's a view I expressed to him before he was elected leader. But I knew that the party wanted to go on to the next generation, as it was then described.
After 7 years of squabbling, Dr Hewson, a trained economist, was able to sell himself as a man beyond politics.
Well, I never pretended to be a politician, and I actually feel that it's important that we break down the so-called old school of politics anyway. I think we've drifted too far in Australia, where the so-called politics, the blood sport, the personality game has now dominated at the expense of sensible policy, common sense policy.
John Hewson had been advisor to John Howard as treasurer in the Fraser government. A decade later, Hewson still smarted over what he thought was Fraser's inaction.
Decisions could have been taken rather than ultimately being delayed, like financial sector deregulation, or, decisions that weren't all that difficult at the time, like the introduction of a broad-based goods and services tax, could have been done.
Politically, let's say you do decide you're going to have the consumption tax. You're then almost in an impossible position, aren't you?
I'm not looking for popularity. I'd rather have a reputation for being able to address the problem and address realistic solutions to those problems. It would be difficult to sell, but that shouldn't be any reason to run away from it.
Hewson came in, and it sort of became an article of faith that we mustn't have any divisions. You know, we'd had all these divisions in the 80s that cost us government. I think people totally misinterpreted what was needed, and debate was stifled. I think there was inadequate debate in the shadow cabinet, inadequate debate in the party room, but all for good motives.
Dr Hewson proclaimed his economic medicine: tough government spending cuts and a consumption tax.
The present ramshackle system of indirect taxes has to be reformed. An essential element of that reform is to move to a broad-based indirect tax of the GST type.
5 people would pull the whole package together. Shadow Treasurer Peter Reith and Reith Senior Advisor Peter Hendy at first wanted to make it simple.
It was felt by Peter Reith and his staff that it was impossible to produce a completely detailed policy on the GST. Therefore, they were aiming at a short 10-page policy which would actually state that it was impossible to produce all the detail.
I didn't have to argue the case very strongly for major change and for a detailed piece of work. I think that there are selective historical memories in this business now, and everybody has been differentiating their product, and they're trying to tag Houston with a lot. Well, Houston's happy to take responsibility for the lot. But I do remember a lot of people who supported me in some of the things I wanted to do. Will the Prime Minister please tell for the record the whole story of the Kirribilli House conspiracy?
Situation arose in
By 1991, the public was mesmerised by a political duel to the death between Bob Hawke and Paul Keating.
I wanted his job and I tried to take it off him. It's as simple as that.
Hewson was left to work on a 600-page economic manual called Fightback.
From the poor to give to the rich, mate.
I'd rather give them a job than a welfare check, wouldn't you?
We'd go through interminable meetings that lasted for hours. Houston would decide on a 6.5% GST as he did at one stage, and we'd all be pretty happy about it. And Reece people would troop back to their room, and then the next day they get a phone call and say, "Peter, I think we need to discuss over that again."
It's not a question of it being indecisive, it's a question of making sure that you've got it right. And we were trying something that had never been tried anywhere in the Western world, and we were in opposition trying to win government by telling the truth and supplying people with the detail that would either convince them or they'd use it to hang us.
I felt that the party had not played a sufficient part in the policy development, and we hadn't been able to. I mean, there'd been no mechanism to do that. The parliamentary party responsible for policy, John had kept it very much to himself and his small coterie of people, and there was really no way that one could break into that at that point in time. We didn't have the mechanisms.
Any dissent on any policy issue at any time of any magnitude or volume was seen as disloyalty, and that was a nonsense.
I was brought in slightly earlier than the general party room, but not much earlier, and asked to do a job of vetting Fightback and to look at it purely from a political point of view. And I had a group of other people with me who were regarded as politically sensitive. I suspect we might have been regarded behind our backs as fairly wet or something, and therefore as sort of like canaries in a gold mine or in a coal mine. And I went through it, and I found some things which I thought were appallingly wrong and unsaleable. And I can remember taking one thing in particular up with John, getting really put down, not only privately but in front of the rest, as not being sufficiently courageous.
It's been first class, very frank comments, very, very solid exchanges. I thank you very much for that. I'm very pleased to announce that we have agreed that the broad-based goods and services tax should be levied at a rate of 15%. Very much.
The Fightback announcement was a great initial success. Lower personal taxes in return for the 15% goods and services tax.
When the policy was announced, people didn't throw up their hands in horror at this Fightback package. They looked at it, the party, the press, and said, "This is marvellous." And for some months we had a marvellous run with nothing but praise and support for the policy.
Early indications are the